Aloha and welcome to Island Connections. I'm Ibrahim Aoude. Obama's Middle East foreign policy. To discuss this, we have Farideh Farhi with us, and thank you for coming, Farideh. She's an independent scholar and also an adjunct professor of political science at University of Hawai'i, Mānoa. So, Farideh, you teach about foreign policy, about Middle East politics and so forth, and I know you are a close observer of the Middle East scene, especially Iran and all the troubles that are going around Iran at the moment, and so there's lots of those problems. So in general, what do you think about, or how would you describe the situation extant, especially after Obama visited Israel, the state of Israel, that is, Jordan, and the Palestinian National Authority territories. So how do you see all this?
Obama has so many balls that he has to juggle with in the Middle East that it's very difficult to sum it up. But in terms of this particular trip that he took, that took him to essentially to Israel and occupied territories as well as Jordan, his task from my point of view was essentially a couple of things. On the one hand, on the Israeli-Palestinian issue, I think he just wanted to sort of appease the peace camp in Israel, that the United States is still interested in some sort of a two-state solution. But generally speaking, the tenor of his talk, as well as the way he treated the Palestinians, essentially suggests that the United States really is not interested in pursuing any kind of concerted effort to bring about or to reignite the peace process. The only process that he seemed to be interested in was some sort of a process that assures Israeli dominance of the situation for the next few years, essentially letting the Israelis know that they have to manage their own. A part of the reason he did that, as I personally think, is because of his interest in the domestic agenda. And there was so much pressure on him, essentially saying that he has no interest in Israel, or in his heart is not really with the Israelis, that he felt that unless he deals with that issue and commits himself all the way, he would not be able to pursue his domestic agenda because of the forces that exist in the society. And in the process, he said some astounding things. Standing next to Prime Minister Netanyahu, he said Israel and United States are eternal friends, that under no circumstances can be separated, which, you know, in terms of foreign policy and pursuit of interest, I mean, presumably no country has eternal friends. They have eternal interests, or enemies for that matter, but they have eternal interests. But, you know, completely tying United States to Israel in those terms were in many ways astounding, you could make an argument. But his task was essentially rhetorical, you know, calming the nerves that existed in relationship to his personality and where his heart is. But then there are other outstanding issues in the Middle East. Obviously, the most important one at this particular moment is the situation of Syria, which is completely out of the control of everybody. And nobody really knows what to do. There's tremendous amount of pressure on the United States to become increasingly involved, become much more assertive, in the assumption being that if the United States becomes assertive, it's going to tip the balance, and it will ultimately lead to the downfall of President Assad in Syria. The reality is that that is just too simplistic, essentially because Assad does have a base of support in Syria, and the forces that have now constituted themselves as the opposition forces are a fractious bunch, and they are being supported by different countries in the region, all sorts of characters are coming from different parts of the Middle East to engage in this fight, and nobody essentially has control of what happens. So Obama's solution to this situation essentially has been to remain, give a little, but essentially remain hesitant in terms of going all the way in trying to push Assad out, because he really does not. And I think rightly so in this situation, believe that ultimately the outcome can be controlled by the United States. But because of the pressures, he has set up a process that has begun increasing American involvement. So he may end up being there, but at this particular moment, it's just a step-by-step process. Then, of course, is the question of Iran, which this week, United States, along with other members of the Security Council, will again meet with Iran to talk about Iran's nuclear program. United States did, in their previous meeting in Almaty, Kazakhstan, agree to move a little bit and abandon some of its demands, but just a little bit. I do not think it's enough for the Iranians, so we'll have to see what's going to happen. Again, in Israel, Obama standing next to Prime Minister Netanyahu committed himself again to this idea of all options are on the table, essentially meaning that the military option is on the table, but again being very unclear about at what point that option will be triggered. But the dynamic is set up as such that if the kind of economic sanctions regime as well as espionage and sabotage of Iran's nuclear program does not work, this process, and the Iranians do not respond, this process may ultimately lead to United States attacking Iran, because Obama himself has said all options are on the table. And then finally, there is the whole, dynamics that you know better than I regarding the the so-called Arab Spring that is quite undetermined, whether we are talking about Egypt, even Tunisia, and of course Libya. Nobody talks about it anymore. That remains quite unsettled on top of everything else. Meanwhile, continuing Obama's trip, Secretary of State Kerry went to Iraq, trying to pressure Iraq to join the anti-Assad coalition. The reality is, Kerry was asking the government of Iraq to do something against its interest, because what is happening in Syria, the instability that is happening in Syria, is ultimately bound to spill into Iraq and embolden the opposition to the current government that exists in Syria. So, in effect, it was quite a bold move on the part of the United States to go into Iraq, essentially demanding that Iraq would engage in behavior that would undermine its own security. And the Iraqis essentially, for the right reasons in terms of their own interests, snubbed the American demands.
Yeah, so from what you have described, which is a very good way of beginning the talk, is that the U.S. actually is playing several chords at once. So
you're saying it's not playing many balls, they're playing from one
several
chord to another.
or several ropes jumping.
Yeah, exactly.
Because on the one hand, they say that they want a peaceful resolution to the Syrian problem. On the other hand, over the past year or so, they would say like, no, don't, advising the Syrian military opposition to not relinquish its arms after Assad had called for them to, put down their arms and join in a dialogue. So the Americans, Hillary Clinton specifically, said we advise them not to do so. Meaning that, they want the thing to continue on. On the other hand, they say, we cannot envision, like Kerry, I think Kerry, envision talks without Assad, so Assad should be in on the talks. At one point he said that. Then Kerry himself goes to Iraq and tries to persuade him into joining the coalition against Syria. So so what is the United States really doing? In doing so, what is it really? What's its aim?
It is a very confused. I mean, I personally think United States policy is extremely confused. That is to say, you see exactly the same dynamic in, for example, in relationship to United States policy on Iran, because there is so much disagreement about what to do. What ends up essentially determining policy are tactical maneuvers that seem at the moment to be successful. In terms of some sort of a strategic understanding of what our plan is and what we want to get at, there is really a tremendous amount of or lack of clarity. Let us not forget that 2 years ago, when the situation in Syria began in terms of a popular democratic movement to bring about change in Syria, United States essentially jumped in very rapidly into this Assad must go bandwagon, essentially for one basic reason. And it had nothing to do with the democratic movement of Syria. It had to do with the fact that if we could peel away Syria away from Iran, then Iran will be weakened. And then in its negotiations with United States, it will be in a much weaker position. So the strategy essentially was to become engaged, to get rid of, to call on Assad to leave on very, very wrong premises. Not understanding the political dynamics in Syria. And now United States is essentially stuck in that position that was enunciated 2 years ago, announced. Obama himself said Assad must go. And now, every day you have different demands that are being articulated that the United States has to respond to. So on the one hand, for example, there is the humanitarian crisis, okay? Whether it's, impacting Jordan in terms of the refugee camps or in Turkey. Then there is also this reality that Assad is hitting back, okay? Therefore, United States has to commit itself, for example, to the protection of Turkey. Patriot missiles being deployed on the border. So in a sense, what I'm trying to suggest to you is that the United States is responding off the cuff. And there are forces in the United States, the same people who took us to war with Iraq, the same pundits and the same, people that have not learned are also putting tremendous amount of pressure and essentially making the argument that Obama is too soft on this situation, assuming that if United States goes for a much bigger push, something major will happen. But the reality is that Obama is also stuck because, he is the president of a country that has absolutely no interest in becoming overtly entangled in a foreign war. That is why, effectively the government is again lying to its population and saying United States is not in any way passing along armament to the opposition. We are just helping tactically, but he has to operate within that reality, and the policy is not clear because nobody, and I ask you, has been able to clarify for anyone, the American population or elsewhere, what is the interest, American interest that is involved in United States becoming involved in Syria. Okay. Now, it is true that people are making a humanitarian case, but that humanitarian case, there are many other places one can make a humanitarian case.
Who brought about this humanitarian case in the first place?
Exactly. But the point you are making, which is that ultimately the reality of Syria and the balance of forces is as such that after 2 years it's become very clear neither side can purge the other side, that ultimately a solution to the problem is some sort of a negotiation that involves all the parties that are doing the fighting, including the Assad government. But that doesn't fit, okay, with the strategy that the United States enunciated 2 years ago, which is Assad must go, and of course what American allies in the region, including Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and Turkey are pursuing, which is they just recognize the opposition as representative of the Syrian people in the Arab League. So that does not fit with that dynamic, but nobody really has any solutions to the problem. On top of that, of course, is the reality that the outside forces that are arming the opposition have different horses. So, the fact that the Qataris and the Saudis are both supporting the opposition against the Assad regime does not mean that they are playing together, because they have their own players, and that has complicated the dynamic in Syria.
Yeah, but that's the thing. Like a number of analysts are talking about it in multiple ways. One would say, well, there are problems between the Qataris and the Saudis in terms of at least the Qataris are supporting the Muslim Brothers, whereas the Saudis are supporting the Salafis, even on the ground in Syria. That's one. But the question is, why are these guys supporting this and the other guys supporting that? Simply because they have different interests, economic and otherwise. That's why they need other players or different players to help them play the game in Syria. You have to have pawns to do it. Without pawns, you cannot play chess, for instance. So that's one. But then ultimately, if everybody thinks that okay, everyone has to sit down with everyone else to work out some kind of agreement around Syria. The fact of the matter, would the Al-Qaeda people who are carrying the brunt of the battle in Syria, would they be at the table with the Americans? That's that's where the Americans have put themselves.
Yeah, but the Americans are doing the same thing in Afghanistan,
Absolutely.
and, in relationship to Taliban too. So yes, I think that's where the incoherence of American foreign policy becomes evident. There is no doubt, to my mind, that what has happened in the area since the early 1990s, which essentially had to do with the fact that Soviet Union disappeared, led to a series of actions on the part of the United States that was presumed or based on, you might want to call it hubris, arrogance, imperial design, you know, Soviet Union, the Cold War rival that, along with United States, shaped politics in the Middle East was no longer there. So United States, you know, becomes increasingly involved in the region in a very, very muscular way, as the neoconservatives would like to call it. And ultimately, you know, we see the ultimate result of that in relationship to Iraq. But that policy has clearly failed, okay? The Iraqis are not listening to United States, you know, for reasons that are completely understandable. As I suggested before, the Americans go into Iraq and essentially say, you must act against your own interests in the region, you know, because we say so. The Iraqis ultimately end up saying, you know, either they don't say no, but in practice, they'll do what they want to do, because simply you cannot ask other countries to behave that way. So it has reached a position whereas, you know, it's just stopgap measures trying to figure out what to do, as I think United States is facing a very critical moment, which is, for example, trying to disentangle itself from some key areas in the region, including Afghanistan. So it's a very dangerous moment for United States in terms of its military capabilities and military vulnerabilities in the region. And yet, at the same time, it is unable to let go of its past practices, which is to go into the countries and essentially, I want you to do this. But the reality is that things are out of control. So the end result is absolutely incoherent policies, even in an area United States seems successful. Okay, for example, in the international coalition that was able to put together to sanction the Iranian regime in the most ferocious way possible in the history of sanctioning of the world. You know, United States has managed to sanction Iran's central bank. The Iranians cannot pay for whatever they buy. When they sell their oil, other countries cannot pay them back in foreign currency. They cannot pay them back in dollars. So even in that kind of a situation where United States seems extremely successful, the Obama administration particularly, the whole policy is dominated by successful tactics. There is no strategic outlook in terms of what if these tactics don't pay off, what are we going to do in the face of this reality that Obama sits in the middle of a country that has no stomach for another war in the region.
But that's why he has this kind of strategy, that is, let others fight my wars for me, you know, and hence like the question of using Al-Qaeda people in Syria, for instance, and not only in Syria and Lebanon, through his allies, Saudi Arabia, etc. I mean, in Lebanon, we never heard of Salafis before.
Yeah.
Only like recently, we've had like hundreds of Salafis, if not thousands now. They are all financed with the blessings of the United States by Saudis, you know.
Which was the dynamic.
Yeah.
Which was the dynamic in Afghanistan
Absolutely,
also. And you would assume that given that history and given that experience, United States has become wise and would not pursue a similar dynamic in other places. But as you suggest, this sectarian game that is being played in its most, atrocious manner, okay? For example, the Saudis are even paying the Salafis in Egypt. So the Salafis in Egypt have now developed this virulent anti-Shiite language and philosophy where they're talking about killing Shiites, you know, and not allowing them in. So that sectarian game that is being played, as you say, it's very, very difficult not to assume that United States is nodding and saying, go ahead, okay? Because okay, you would assume, either you have to assume that the United States has lost complete control over the region, has no leverage to even tell its allies what to do, okay? Or, you have to start thinking about this possibility that the United States is actually fanning the sectarian game for instrumental purposes. The problem is that ultimately this sectarian game is also going to come and bite the United States, okay? So the same Salafis who are engaged in a very anti-Shiite, virulent kind of politics also hate United States. I mean, we saw what happened, for example, in Libya. Okay. Now, I must point out that Obama did have one success, important success, in going to the region, which was to get Prime Minister Netanyahu apologize to the Turkish Prime Minister for Turkish president actually for attacking the Turkish ship that was trying to break the sanctions regime or embargo around Gaza, and that everybody is essentially understands it as being yet another attempt to create a coalition that now includes Israel, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar to take care of the Assad's regime. I'm not sure again it's going to work out because there are all sorts of complications that continue to remain between the Turkish as well as Israeli government.
Yeah, so that's another example, concrete example of how the United States plays different chords at once, right? Or has so many balls in the air at once. But the problem is that every time it has done so, it boomeranged against it. Okay, so let's say people forgot about Afghanistan and the Taliban and all this, okay? But then we have the recent example that you pointed out, which was Libya.
Yeah, exactly.
Libya wasn't, when was it? 2011, right? So it's less than 2 years ago. And we all know what happened to the U.S. ambassador in Benghazi and so forth. It seems to me that under Obama's first term and second, he's still following the same kind of neoconservative policy, garbed in a different, way, but using different tactics or a strategy that has the same strategic goals, though, right? I mean, instead of going with troops, they are, going through other,
but I'm not exactly,
whatever. So,
I mean, I understand that I don't understand exactly what that strategic goal is.
Yeah, well,
okay,
we can talk about that.
Yeah, exactly. Right. That is to say, or the objectives that they are pursuing are so unrealistic and so dangerous in terms of the implications of it, that then one has to wonder about the sanity of the people who are making those decisions. Let me give you an example, okay? Let us assume that the objective, because of the opportunity that arose, was to get rid of the Assad's government, okay? Now, you know better than I how difficult it is to maintain stability in Syria, okay? So if the objective is getting rid of Assad, that's the strategic objective because it ultimately weakens Iran and hopefully opens the path for a regime change in Iran. The first step itself is extremely problematic, unrealistic, and dangerous, okay? Because given the dynamics of Syria itself. Secondly, let us assume that United States was successful. Okay, let us assume a year ago, and Assad would fall, and a orderly transition had occurred in Syria. Okay?
Yeah.
I mean, people, when they talk about regime change, they talk about it as though, you know, today one regime goes and tomorrow somebody else comes. And everything is going to be the same. The same state will be maintained and so on. That didn't even
Happened
work.
in Iraq.
Yeah, exactly. Well, it didn't even occur in Egypt. In Egypt, you have it, you know, you maintain the state, presumably, and you just brought Muslim Brotherhood instead of Mubarak. But Egypt is in a mess. You know, it's still, we do not know which direction it's going to go. But that's a good example, presumably. But let us assume that there would have been an orderly transition in Syria. Syria would flip completely. Iran is weakened. It opens the path for regime change in Iran. Okay? Again, you're faced with a situation where, first of all, the people who are governing Iran, they're not just 5 people, okay? You have a robust state that has at least the support of 10, 15, 20 million people out of a population of 70 million. Okay, at least. Okay, they're not gonna
just give up.
Give up and leave. So you're gonna have an extremely, the process of changing regime in Iran would be an extremely destabilizing process right in the middle of the Middle East. Okay, so, you know, and this is where, you know, you have all these forces that are working to destabilize any regime that exists in the Middle East, including the Saudi, the Qatari, whatever, would come into play, and you have a tinderbox. So that's why I asked the question of what is the strategic objective. Either they have, you know, they haven't worked this out in terms of what exactly we want in the Middle East, or the kind of plans that they have, the ones that have thought about it in such ideological and such dangerous terms that it has no other way but to bring us Iraq in a much more vicious and problematic and dangerous scale.
Yeah, the way they are thinking about it, I agree with you. I mean, they think about it ideologically and thinking about it from methodology of pragmatism, you know. Okay, we want Assad to go, so let's do whatever, and then later on things take care of themselves. Well, that doesn't work. I mean, and they tried it so many times, and yet they're doing the same thing. But the problem is, suppose, well, now what is happening in Syria is really affecting things in Lebanon. And so I want to ask you again, I mean, given all this, what we have said, what, if you were like to say, okay, this is U.S. strategy, you know, rather than that they don't know what they're doing, you know. Well, what would it be? I mean, from all what we have said, what would you say it is U.S. strategy?
At this point?
Yeah.
The only, if I'm forced to make to not say that I think they don't know what their strategy is. If I'm forced, I would say their strategy is to fan sectarian conflict in the Middle East, maintain a destabilized Middle East. So no, from their point of view, no country in the region can become dominant or prominent in the region. This kind of sectarian game at least prevents the rise of a country like Iran from developing more clout in the region. If I'm forced to, you know, to think in terms of United States actually having a strategy, that's the only thing that one can see. Okay, the kind of sectarian politics that ultimately destabilizes the region, and while at the same time maintains Israeli security.
Yeah, this is something that I was going to say you alluded to earlier in terms of first thing Israel everything else follows as regard to a dominant Israel in the
one
area.
has to understand why that is the case, because Israel is the only place in the Middle East that the U.S. has total confidence in terms of being on our side.
Yeah.
Everything else can flip.
Hence the eternal
Yes,
alliance. Or whatever,
exactly.
yeah.
I mean, Egypt can flip. I mean, we saw United States actually try to create another pillar in the region, which was Iran during Shah's time, and that one flipped in 1979. But Israel cannot flip because its survival is dependent on United States. That's the reality of Israeli existence. And Israel can be used in different ways to promote American interests in the region. So, you know, again, I'm not exactly sure whether that's the way. I cannot think about it in terms of individuals sitting in one room and essentially making a decision that we're going to pursue a sectarian game in the region.
No, that's not the way it plays.
Okay. I think there are just too many different players, too many institutional stakeholders that are competing, and the end result is a mishmash that is actually intensifying the agony of the region as far as its people are concerned.
Yeah, and the maestro, the most you know, useful maestro for now is Obama. He's trying to figure out all these things, given all the combinations of forces within U.S. foreign policy establishment, or the ruling elite, not only foreign policy establishment, but the ruling elite.
As I said, in the midst of a situation where the overwhelming concern of the country, as well as the governing elite, is domestic. Both because of the economic problems, as well as you know, potential political problems that the country may have to face in the, you know, in the face of, you know, vast income inequalities and so on.
Yeah. So we can go one of two ways now, but let me go regarding the relationship between domestic and foreign policy, U.S. And we have seen over the past, since let's say at least 2001 with the invasion of Afghanistan, etc., that actually a foreign policy brings about disaster to domestic policy and vice versa. It's a two-way street, And so assuming that they want to, the U.S., for instance, or the ruling elite in the U.S. wants to foment chaos in the Middle East region for whatever reason, well, that really comes to bite them, you know, in the rear end, basically, and it has so far. I mean,
no, but that's what I mean. That's where the tension lies, Ibrahim. I really do think that United States, there are forces in United States that would like to disentangle from the Middle East, you know, orderly departure from the Middle East. Okay, that was the motto in relationship to Iraq. Obviously, 2014. It'll be Afghanistan, which is very close. So I really do think that they are, and that's where, you know, United States itself has a deadlocked political system. And that deadlock is not only over domestic politics, it's also connected to foreign policy. And that is why I say, for example, in a case like Iran, where I closely follow, I really do see a real disagreement or a fissure about how to approach Iran. But that fissure is so deadlocked that on the question of the strategic question of what to do with Iran, that essentially nothing gets done. Okay, so the only thing that is agreement on is the tactical issues. Okay, and how do you create that agreement? On the one hand, there are some people who come and say, yes, let's sanction Iran, let's sabotage its nuclear program, and hopefully let's do escalating sanction, and it's going to pressure Iran so much that there's going to be a regime change, okay? Then there is these other folks that say, okay, let's sanction Iran and use coercive diplomacy in order to avoid war, okay? So, you know, supposedly they come from different point of view in relationship to Iran. Those who want to avoid war ultimately also want to make a deal with Iran, you know, change the dynamic, but you know, they come into the sanction bandwagon and sanction tactic because they want to avoid war. And that dynamic, as I said, creates a unified position in relationship to tactics, but there is absolutely no agreement on what to do with Iran, so the situation becomes even more and more dangerous.
Yeah, it seems to me from what you said, I'm gathering that actually both sides are reading two sets of tea leaves, which have nothing to do with social reality or what's going on the ground. And that is ideological, but at the same time pragmatic, you know, in terms of its methodology, because they're saying, well, what we see in the tea leaves on the ground, because the tea leaves would be on the ground, is what's actually happening on the ground, and that is not the case.
No, it also has to do with the past history of thinking or being able to change realities on the ground, you know, impose your will. And that reality has also changed. You know, it's not possible to do that kind of, you know, United States simply does not have the kind of clout and resources to sort of, you know, shape and reshape reality in the Middle East anymore. So, but the consciousness has not caught up with that kind of dynamic.
Yeah, just like in terms of domestic policy, when like I remember when Obama was running for the first time, he was talking about change. Somebody said, change, okay, but what kind of change? So anybody can change things on the ground, like, you know, suicide bomber might go and create some change. The U.S. can go with a bigger bomb and create more change, but that change is scarce and not necessarily in the interest of the United States, as we can see at this point. Now, I intentionally did not bring in yet the Russians and the Chinese into the picture, you know. So suppose we go in with the Russians and Chinese in the act that's happening in the Middle East. One might say the following, for instance, see if you agree with me, and then we go from there. That, in fact, were it not for the Russians, probably the Americans or their allies or the Turks, etc., would have come into Syria and called it a day, you know, I mean, wiped out the regime, etc., through NATO and the rest of it, as they did, as happened in Libya. But actually, whether that might have been the case or not, we don't know. But the fact of the matter is that it seems to me that the Russians have different interests in the Middle East than from the United States, and therefore they are putting a check on U.S. or NATO kind of actions, military or otherwise. So how do you see that, and to what extent you see the Russian role, at least, if not the Chinese?
Okay. It's interesting because as I was coming in, there was a piece in NPR about former Russian President Medvedev, where now there are television programs, you know, exposés against him. And one of the charges against him is about Libya, and effectively the Russian decision not to veto, I guess, the decision by NATO to go into United Nations decision to do something about Libya. I think Libya changed the dynamics in the region, and there is no doubt that the Russians felt that United States and ultimately NATO went beyond what they had agreed to. So they felt betrayed, and they did not think that they had given agreement to NATO going after Gaddafi and getting rid of him. So there is no doubt about that, that the Russian intransigence in relationship to Syria is very much influenced by what happened in Libya. However, there are a couple of important caveats that sort of enter into the discussion. First of all, geopolitically or geographically, Syria is very different, okay, than Libya, where, you know, the kind of military operation, given the nature of the major Libyan cities closer to the Mediterranean, made a lot of difference in terms of military operation. It was much easier, you know, it took a long time, nevertheless, but it was much easier. So I do not think that even if the Russians had agreed, you know, ultimately both the Russians and Chinese vetoed any kind of international intervention into Syria, but the operation itself would have been much more different. First of all. Secondly, Russian interests in Syria are much deeper. In fact, you know, if you remember, Gaddafi had flipped. Gaddafi was a one-man operation anyway on his own, really never had serious relationship with Russia either. You know, they never trusted him, but, you know, several years before the operation, he had actually flipped. He had given up his nuclear program, supposedly, and changed his ways and had entered presumably the Western camp. Syria has had a long-standing, you know, since 1970s, you know, relationship with, you know, the Russians have a base in Tartus. Giving up Syria effectively for the Russians would essentially mean, you know, abandoning the Middle East completely. But I think the Russians also have a very, very serious concern about what instability in Syria means in terms of the fanning of the most retrograde, radical Islamist forces that will end up being an issue for Russia itself.
It already had been, like, you know, Chechnya and other places.
Exactly. So, you know, we have a habit of constantly thinking about other countries as having very problematic intentions or malintentions without ever thinking about what, you know, or listening to what they are saying. So, and obviously that plays a very, very important role in the Russian calculation in the region. But, you know, United States 2 years ago, thinking that getting rid of Assad would be easy, took a position. Obama came out and said, Assad must go. And they've been stuck. And they have not, he has not been able to back away from that statement, despite lip service to this idea of a political solution.
Yeah, well, Assad's term ends in 2014.
Does it?
So assuming nobody assassinates him, because there have been a number of stories, you know, rumors about he was assassinated, shot at, blah, 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 but none of this was correct. I mean, the Russians know that, for instance, they can be pressured in terms of like Islamists, radical Islamists of the worst kind, you know, the most retrograde you mentioned, would be fighting in their own territories. So why would I want to not fight them in Syria, for instance? And therefore, this whole tug of war or adversarial position between the United States and Russia.
I want to say something else in terms of your point, that had the Russians not vetoed, Assad might have been gone by now. I'm not sure of that. But you know, and the reason for that, I mean, as someone that I would use to support my argument, is the first person that actually went into Syria to try to reach a political solution, which is the former Secretary General of United Nations, Kofi Annan. And Kofi Annan was very clear. When he was asked, okay, when he was told that it's the Russians and the Chinese, that are preventing any kind of solution, he outright came and said, okay, let us assume that the Russians and the Chinese had not vetoed this international intervention. What was the plan next? Okay, certainly, United States would not be willing to send troops. I mean, the reality is that Assad cannot be overthrown unless there is massive military intervention on the ground inside Syria. Certainly, Turkey is not capable of doing that. Certainly, the Israelis would not want to do that. The most everybody would be willing to do is to bomb the hell out of all the cities in Syria. And that, I think, it's very important to understand. That sort of brings us back to the question of how different Syria is in geographically from Libya.
Right, right. I mean, even the Syrians were saying, we do not, people in opposition to Syria, they say, well, for instance, the Russians tell the Syrians what to do. And the Syrians basically came out and said, we don't take orders from nobody. We deal with them one-on-one on equal terms, and that is true.
That's Foreign Minister Lavrov said, go and tell him to leave.
That's right.
I've been he's not listening to me. Doesn't listen,
That's true. And the Syrians have a lot of cards to play. I mean, one is like, if they're going, then it'll be the Samson option for them, which is different from the Israeli Samson option, which is like use of nuclear weapons. They just, the Syrians would make it like an all-out war in the region. And they have their own allies to do so, because Iran and Syria is a strategic alliance, although not eternal, but a strategic alliance. And they said that we won't allow the Syrians, the Iranians, to fight it, go it alone, I mean, for the longest term, but that we will come to their own defense. Whether now they are coming to their own defense or not, and to what extent and what means, that remains to be discussed. But the fact of the matter is that it could explode in the face of the United States and Israel and everything. I mean, Lebanon, if Lebanon explodes, and it's now teetering on the edge of, being just like another civil war or something, I don't know, hopefully not. But that would not be good for the United States, even though the United States will have achieved yet more death and destruction and chaos, etc., which might be one of the intermediate means for it to achieve whatever goal it has in mind, and I have no idea what that might be, beyond the question of Israel would remain dominant and safe so long the other guys are fighting it out among each other, among one another. But Hezbollah in Lebanon said, I mean, any attack on Lebanon, we will hit Israel. And he said, we don't need chemical weapons, because Israel has Haifa city and the port are full of chemical things. We just have to hit those guys, hit those things. So the Israelis are kind of leery about, to support your
well, the
point.
Israelis,
The Israelis are leery about getting into a big mess like this, which leads me to think also, I mean, are they stupid, I ask myself, enough to go and bomb Iran? The Israelis.
The Israelis really do not have the capability to bomb Iran.
Well, if the U.S. gives them the capability.
Well,
but are they stupid? I mean, in terms of strategic.
No. I mean, and the Iranians have essentially called their bluff too. I mean, just 2 weeks ago, leader of Iran, Khamenei, said, if you attack us, we'll attack Tel Aviv and Haifa. He specifically mentioned names. And the Israelis really do not. I mean, they may have a capability to go and do one run. But then coming back, they probably need refueling from Americans. And, Iran's nuclear program is so spread out. They're just not, you know, not a possibility. I think it's a game that was being played to impact American domestic politics and get, you know, as I said before, you know, for Obama to go and show that his heart is really with the Israelis. And it has to do with the insecurity of Israeli polity in general and the reality that the situation they are trying to continue and maintain is an impossible situation over a long run, you know, to claim that we're going to have a democratic Jewish state. You know, it's
how could it be democratic and Jewish at the same time?
Exactly, and with occupation, exactly.
Yeah.
But that's what I'm trying to say, and you know, the worry about American public opinion changing and all sorts of different things. So Iran has always been a very, very important part of that dynamic. And I have always made an argument that the reason the Israelis, what they are mostly fearful of, is for United States and Iran to actually engage in a conversation, because then, you know, the threat, you know, the so-called threat to American interest and everybody else's interest in the region disappears, and then all the attention will now turn to Israel and say, what are you going to do with the occupation? Iran is always a very, very good, has been, and the Iranians have played their part in that by making themselves look evil and act evil in that way. But, you know, that I think is the constant worry on the part of Israelis.
Yeah. But another thing, like in this entire shuffle, the Palestinians are, you know, being forgotten. That's a lost thing. And the ethnic cleansing of Palestine continues, you know, on the West Bank, and especially in Jerusalem, which is part of the West Bank. And some people are talking about a third intifada, a third uprising, you know. So what do you think?
Well, I mean, I do not think it's a sustainable situation. And I think, you know, what the Israelis fear the most is actually what people have talked about, the civil rights movement, you know, that essentially saying, you know, we are effectively living in a country that is one country, except more than half of the population is being, you know, now the Palestinian population in this all area, West Bank, Israel, and Gaza is more than the Jewish population. And this situation is not sustainable. Now the Israelis might maintain it for a while, but you know, ultimately everybody knows.
But both the Israeli government, especially the new one, and the Israeli people in their overwhelming majority are against, you know, the Palestinians and against some kind of agreement on having like a two-state solution at this point. They want like the whole cake and they want to eat it as well. I mean, that's the majority of the population.
I think the Israeli population is still divided on that issue. If you ask them, you know, peaceful two-state solution, they would go for that. Certainly, they would go for that much more than a one-state solution.
That's true. But even with those, what kind of state? I mean, you know, and with whom are you going to negotiate? No, we don't want to negotiate with Hamas. As though, well, who are you going to negotiate with? You know, Abbas. Abbas cannot.
No. The Israelis are completely
cannot order his own guards what to do at this point. I'm exaggerating, but just to make the point, you know, Exactly. So that's a very interesting situation. So Obama is going to the Middle East, therefore really exacerbated the situation rather than...
Well, as I said, he is, from my point of view, going to the Middle East was essentially a show. You know, on the main, you know, his intention was essentially to come back to the United States and set this Israeli question to the side so he can pursue his domestic agenda, whatever that is. In the process, he had presumably had a diplomatic coup, improving the relationship between Turkey and Israel, but I do not think that that is a sustainable dynamic. And the situation really has not changed. And the situation has not changed, it means that this process of worsening is continuing.
Yeah. Well, we're out of time. Thank you very much for coming to talk with us about this important topic. And thanks to our viewers, and we'll see you next month in May. Aloha.